Peak by Roland Smith, Chapter 16, Part 2, ABC. I had a miserable night. I went a little overboard in my hydration and had to get up 3 times to pee. Then it seemed that every time I started to doze off, a boulder from the slope let loose, causing me to sit up in terror as I waited for it to crush us. But the worst problem was my throat. By morning it felt like I had a hard-boiled goose egg lodged in it. With all my tossing and turning and peeing, I don't imagine that Sanjo got much sleep either, but he didn't complain. On a bright note, the morning was as mild as the previous morning, and Holly was much improved. She managed to walk to the mess tent to have breakfast with us. The night before, Zopa had served her dinner in her tent. The herders and yaks left an hour before we did. They could go straight up to ABC without stopping at Camp 2, which should give you some idea of the kind of shape they were in compared to us. JR came up as I was packing the tent and said he wanted to do an interview with me before we headed up. Sanjo and Zopa were packing up Holly's gear. I had already done several of these interviews down at base camp, and I dreaded doing any more. I had discovered that a camera in my face and a microphone boom dangling above my head turned me into a babbling idiot. "Just act natural," JR would say. "Be yourself." Right. Then he would give me little prompts like, "What's it feel like to be up on the world's greatest mountain with your dad?" Or, "How does being up on Everest compare to climbing skyscrapers?" I would try to answer the questions with straightforward honesty and end up spewing forth the most incredibly lame answers imaginable. I stopped packing and joined the crew, trying not to look too glum. They had positioned the camera in front of the rotting slope, and I was up all night listening to the slope belch boulders. Will made me squat, pulled the hood off my head so they could see my face, and wiped off all my glacial cream, which I had just carefully applied. "Man, wouldn't it be great if one of those big boulders let loose while we're doing this?" Jack said. He was the sound guy and was always hoping that something horrible would happen when the film was rolling. "Okay," JR said, "we're going to keep it real simple today. I just want you to repeat what you said yesterday about the yaks and porters. That was really poignant. And you are absolutely right. I don't know if they'll use it in the final version, but they sure ought to." I was thrilled. In fact, during my sleepless night, I had thought about what I said and wished they'd had the camera rolling. JR gave the cue. "On 3, 2, 1, tape rolling." I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. "We're rolling," JR said impatiently. The camera batteries didn't last very long in cold weather. I tried again, but nothing came out. "Any time, Peak." "A boulder's coming loose," Jack said excitedly. "Come on, Peak." I pointed to my mouth and shook my head. My voice was gone. JR swore. "That boulder's ready to pop," Jack said. "I think it's going to miss us, but it will definitely be in the frame." "Zopa!" JR yelled. "Can you come over here for a little stand-up?" Zopa shook his head and pointed at Sanjo. "Let Sanjo do it." "Get out of the frame, Peak," JR shouted. I moved and Sanjo quickly stepped into my place. "We're still rolling," JR said. "Talk about your feelings toward the mountain, Sanjo. Maybe something about your father. On 3, 2, 1. My father came to Sagarmatha when he was my age." Sanjo said it in his cool accent. "He started as a porter and worked his way up to become a Sherpa and an assistant Sirdar. He told me that he climbed mountains so I would not have to, but I think there was more to it than this. The boulder Jack hoped would fall did, along with a ton of other debris. Sanjo did not flinch or even glance behind him at the mini avalanche. He just kept talking, and JR kept filming. My father was a stranger to me, but here on the mountain I am getting to know him through the conversations of the Sherpas and climbers and porters. I came here to see the mountain, but what I'm discovering is my father." "Beautiful," JR said. It was beautiful, and I hate to admit it, but I was a little jealous of Sanjo's smooth performance. Unlike me, he was totally comfortable in front of the video camera. JR had never praised me after a taping. Of course, I was lousy at it, but still. Jack and Will were patting Sanjo on the back, telling him what a natural he was. I walked back to our tent and finished packing. I don't think they realized I had left. At mid-morning, the weather turned, with gray clouds coming in from the west and a bitterly cold wind blowing down the mountain. I had to stop and put on 3 more layers of clothes. I covered my face with a silk balaclava and wool scarf. My throat was no better, but I trudged on, one step at a time, stopping every half hour, unwinding my shroud to drink, and gagging on every gulp. Zopa walked behind us, still carrying Holly's load and gently coaxing her up the slope as if he were her personal Sherpa or something. I didn't know if she had hired him or promised to give money to the Tibetan monks, or if it was something else. But without him, she would have been going downhill instead of up. It took us 8 hours, half a mile an hour, to get to Camp 2. There were so many climbers there, we barely had room to pitch our tents. Some of the climbers were coming down from Camp 4 above ABC. Some were on their way up to ABC, and some were using the site as their base camp, which was hard to imagine because I could barely breathe. The film crew had to set up their tents on the far side of camp from us. The camp was at the junction of two glaciers, East Rongbuk and Baifeng. You couldn't see the Everest summit from the camp, but there was a spectacular view of 3 other Himalayan peaks, Chase, Chazen, and Laikzin. There wasn't enough room to set up the mess tent, so we were on our own for dinner. I got the stove going while Sanjo walked down to a glacial pond to get water. By the time he got back, it had started snowing. We put the water on the stove and waited for it to boil, which was taking longer and longer the higher we climbed. I wasn't hungry, and I don't think Sanjo was either, but we both knew we had to eat. Sanjo asked me how I was doing. I tried to answer, but all that came out was a hissing croak. It didn't bother me that I couldn't talk. What worried me more was that the sore throat might be the beginning of something worse. There was a nasty virus going through base camp that had everyone in an uproar. If you catch something bad enough, your climb is over. As a result, the teams had circled the wagons by staying in their own camps and suspiciously eyeing the approach of other climbers as if they were plague carriers. Typically, one of the porters was accused of bringing the virus to camp, as if the climbers were incapable of carrying a virus to Everest. As we waited for the water to boil, we watched Zopa set up Holly's tent, which she crawled into as soon as it was up. He then put up his own tent and started making their dinner. I was talking to one of the other climbers, Sanjo said. He told me that tomorrow will be a big test. He's been up to ABC and has spent one night up at Camp 4. He said if we make it that far, we should be able to make it to the summit. I should have been paying more attention to what Sanjo was saying, but at the moment I was having a minor crisis that had nothing to do with my sore throat. What was causing the meltdown was the fact that it had been a relatively easy day, but I was a complete wreck. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. Zopa's words had been echoing in my brain all day, and I was betting that Peak Marcello was in the not crowd, right beside George with the clogged heart and Francis in the Gamoff bag. Dr. Wu had been wrong about my conditioning, or else I had screwed myself up by getting dehydrated. But if that was the case, why wasn't Sanjo suffering? I looked over at him. He was stirring the pot, chattering away like we were camped on a beach. The next morning, Zopa dragged us out of our tent before dawn. There was about a foot of new snow on the ground, but it had stopped falling. "Hard climb today," he said, "and we need to get up fast, or there won't be a place to pitch our tents." "How's your throat?" I shook my head. My voice was still gone, but I didn't feel any worse than I had the night before, which I considered a victory. Outside camp, we started up the trough, a depression that sits between 2 rows of jagged ice pinnacles that looks like giant canine teeth. The main path was well worn and clearly marked by the yaks. Zopa warned us to stay on the path. If you wander off, even to take a pee, you could be lost forever in the ice maze. I promise this is the last time I'm going to talk about high-altitude bodily functions. Answering a call of nature on the mountain is a huge ordeal because at that altitude you can't do anything fast, and you have to take off layer after layer of clothing. It can delay your climb by a half hour or more, which can ruin your chances of getting higher because bad weather moves in so quickly. This is why you try to take care of all this before you leave camp. About noon, we ran into the porters, yaks, and herders heading back down to base camp. They were still whistling and singing, and I was tempted to get in line with them. I think the only thing that stopped me was that Holly had been in front of me all day long, and I wasn't about to let her get any higher up the mountain than me. 2 hours later, we got our first look at ABC. Sunjo pointed out the tiny colored tents in the distance, but the camp wasn't as close as it looked. It was more than 3 more torturous hours away. The only bright spot was that Sunjo and I managed to pass Holly and Zopa about 100 yards before they reached the camp. ABC, 21,161 feet, higher than Kilimanjaro and Mount McKinley, and I felt it. The crude camp made every other place we had stayed seem like paradise. It was situated on a pile of rubble between a glacier that looked like it had been formed by frozen sewage and a rotten rock wall. The ground was littered with ankle-breaking rocks and life-ending crevasses. JR filmed our triumphant arrival. I barely had the strength to even look at the camera as I trudged by it. There were only about 6 tents set up, so there was plenty of room for us to stake out an area for the team. Unlike at base camp, people weren't wandering around socializing. They were either too pooped to move or terrified about twisting something this close to the top. By the time Zopa and Holly arrived, we had our tent set up and a fire going from the wood the porters had left. "How's your throat?" Holly asked. Sunjo and I nearly fell off the rocks we were sitting on. This was the first full sentence she had put together since we left base camp, and her voice almost sounded normal. We had passed her, but she seemed in better shape than we were. "It's still sore," I said with difficulty. "I think there's a doctor up here," she said. "I'll go find him." By the time we had her tent up, she was back with the doctor in tow. He looked like he needed a doctor himself, but he examined my throat, then called Leah Krieger down at base camp. They decided to put me on antibiotics. Josh came on the radio and asked me how it was going. I couldn't answer, so I turned over the radio to Holly, who gave a glowing report. Josh said they were heading up to ABC, then to Camp 4 for a night, and would no doubt see us on our way down. I should mention something about the radios here. The frequencies were wide open, and people had nothing better to do than sit in their tents and monitor the chatter. This included Captain Scheck and the soldiers. As a result, everyone was very careful about what they talked about, especially expedition leaders like Josh. The next day was basically spent lying in our tents trying to breathe, hoping that our red blood cells were doing what they were supposed to be doing. When we moved, it was in slow motion, like we were on the moon. You'd get a plate of food and stare at it, thinking a couple minutes had passed, and tell yourself you should try to eat before it cooled off. Fork to mouth, ice cold. Huh? Look at watch. Half an hour? How? By the morning we left, the antibiotics had kicked in and my throat was better. I even managed to croak out a couple of understandable sentences. Sunjo, on the other hand, wasn't feeling good. He had spent a good deal of the night vomiting outside our tent door. Every time he puked, Zopa would come over and make him drink, worried about dehydration. I felt bad for him, but to be honest, his getting sick perked me up a little. Terrible, I know. I felt better knowing that I wasn't the only one having a difficult time. The 3-day trip took us 9 hours to complete on the way down. We ran into Josh between the first and second camps. He asked how my throat was, then continued toward ABC, shouting down to us that he would see us in a few days. Holly not only carried her own pack on the way down, she beat us to base camp by half an hour. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not.